Hey y'all, making this video using one of the models here at work to see if just something to supplement to kind of help y'all. I feel it'll help me too. So here, got the cerebral cortex around here. So I'm just gonna go through the lab 1 through 4 straight down. So this would be the telencephalon, anything that's the cerebral cortex, right? Anything that's just all of this here, right? This whole part here, right? Once you get to the diencephalon, then you start talking about the thalamus here, right? The epithalamus, the hypothalamus should be right here, this part right here. All right, so the thalamus, right? I think the epithalamus is somewhere around here, and then the hypothalamus right here. So this would all be the diencephalon. And then the mesencephalon is the midbrain. So this part right here. So you see here you have this part in front, the mammillary body from this side, right? And then here you have your midbrain here, and then here your colliculi. So this kind of segment here would be considered that segment of the mesencephalon, right? This whole thing is a mesencephalon. It's just that one part, the midbrain. And you have the metencephalon, right? So the metencephalon would then continue from here, which is essentially the pons, right? So essentially the pons and cerebellum would be that metencephalon part, okay? So pons and cerebellum. And then once you get here to the medulla, right here is a pontomedullary junction where the pons and the medulla separate. So here, right here, this would be from down here, right? Let's say if I do a line right here, that would all be the medulla. So that would be the myelencephalon. So to recap, the telencephalon will be this whole part, the outer part, cerebral cortex. And once you get to the thalamus, hypothalamus, epithalamus, then you have your diencephalon. And then the mesencephalon, which will be the midbrain, will be this whole part here. So including the mammillary bodies, including the colliculi here, and this part here. Then here you have the pontomesencephalic junction, this line right here. If you heard, I have an imaginary line here. Then right here coming down would be the metencephalon, which would be the pons and the cerebellum together. And then again here, the pontomedullary junction here, little line here. Down here would be the medulla, right? And this would be the myelencephalon. So telencephalon, diencephalon, mesencephalon, metencephalon, myelencephalon. So I don't have the duras, but you can kind of just say, right, that tentorium cerebelli, that would be considered the dura mater. And then you have that arachnoid mater, which would be that white skin that you would see on there. So if they get the probe and they kind of get the skin that's on the brain, they say, what is this mater? It will be arachnoid. And then the pia is on the actual brain itself. So those would be those. Let me start here now. So the longitudinal fissure, right, also known as the sagittal fissure or the interhemispheric fissure, would be this long line here in the middle, separating both hemispheres. Then we go inside to the corpus callosum. So right here would be the rostral. So the rostrum, the genu, the body, and then the splenium here in the back, right? So that would be those parts, 4 parts of the corpus callosum. And then you have your midbrain here, right? So as long as it's pointing to this part here, this midbrain part would be that, right? And then pons, again, going back to those cephalons, right? And then the medulla here. So I would say, maybe they ask, what specific part is this right here? If she's asking for specific, I would put genu. Or even then, if you were to just have it there and say, what is this? I would think because it's not on the body, or even then it's just on there, I think you can go, I think it would be fine to go corpus callosum or go really specific and just say the genu. All right, so genu's knee. So here it looks like a little knee. Underneath that would be the rostrum. And then this would be the body. And then the splenium. And there's other parts around here too, but we'll go back into those as I go through the labs. So now going into the frontal lobe. So of course this would be the frontal lobe, this whole part here, and then you have that segment in the middle, that sulcus, the central sulcus separating. See that 5 has the arrow there, and that's what it's pointing to. It's pointing to that central sulcus. So that means you know that on the anterior part, because it's the front of the brain, that anterior part, or rostral part, we're going to use that terminology, would be the precentral gyrus here, which is the primary motor cortex, right? I said Brahman's area 4, but I don't think we need to put numbers, so don't worry about those. At least I'm not going to. And then I think she mentioned if you put 2 fingers here, right on the brain. So I think these 2 gyri, you go from these 2 gyri, so this is the primary motor cortex, you go to these 2 gyri just above that Sylvian fissure here. Right here would be Broca's area right here, right? So they ask, what specific area is this? That's Broca's area. They just ask, you know, what gyrus or what part of the cortex this is. So, you know, 6, if there is a number there, that would be precentral gyrus or primary motor cortex. Okay. And then here is, so on this part then, let's go to the parietal lobe. So now you know that this is the frontal lobe that's being separated by the central sulcus, right? So it's being separated by the central sulcus. That means this part over here, this is the parietal lobe, all of this here. So we know that here is the postcentral gyrus. Postcentral, so somatosensory cortex essentially here. And then you have the parietal occipital sulcus. So that one though, that parietal occipital sulcus can only be seen in sagittal view here, right? And that would be this one right here, this parietal occipital sulcus. Okay. Okay, so if we're gonna go, I'll put this together. If we're gonna go together with this, we're gonna take this as our central sulcus again, and then this would be this gyrus here. All of this would be the primary somatosensory cortex, or the postcentral gyrus. And that means this part over here, this would be the secondary association cortex, because you have your Brahman's area 3, 1, 2. I'm sorry, your Brahman's area 5, 7, and I think here would be 39, 40, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, so this would all be a secondary. So it's right next to it, right? So if we're using anatomical locations, it would be rostral to the postcentral gyrus, right? So this would be, this specific area here would be, I guess you could say parietal lobe, but if it's in the parietal lobe and it asks what segment is this in the parietal lobe, then this would be the secondary association cortex. Okay. Okay, so to recap, central sulcus, primary motor cortex or precentral gyrus, just gonna say that right here, 2 fingers over, Broca's area, and then posterior to the central sulcus, postcentral gyrus, and then posterior to that, secondary association cortex. And then if you want to find your parietal occipital sulcus, it'll be this line here, right here, separating the parietal lobe and the occipital lobe. This sulcus right here. Okay. Okay, so now we're going to the occipital lobe. So I guess if you're looking at it like this, it would be a very small segment here that would be the occipital lobe. However, once you open into it, that's when you're going to start seeing these parts a lot better. So essentially this would be the primary visual cortex, right? Here's your upper bank, your lower bank, right? Going back to those. And then what separates both those is the calcarine fissure here. So this calcarine fissure here separates both banks. So that will make this, and then we'll go into it, right? Like cuneus and then the lingula. Okay, but for sure, no, this is the primary visual cortex. So I think it'd be safe to say, as long as it just has a very small segment here of the occipital lobe, and it's asking for the very small segment, you could say occipital lobe or primary visual cortex. Anything beyond that, right? Let's say like 2 gyrus over, that would start including the 18 and 19, right, as a secondary visual cortex. You remember from the chapters where it was talking about that first part, right, the middle of the retina, and then here on the side of the retina, and then it keeps going further out, right? The more concentric part of the visual field, right? So I would say it'd be safe to say with this would be the occipital lobe, this back part here, right? This part right here, and then coming over here would be more of that. So here's the temporal lobe now. So this would be, right, number 4 would be that whole temporal lobe here, and here's a sylvian fissure here. And if you were to look inside the sylvian fissure, right, then you would see the Herschel's gyrus in there, right? So if I were to open it here and just kind of peel it and then look on this part on the inside, you would see the Herschel's gyrus, and you'll see 2 kind of finger-like, right, structures there, right? And you'll see that it's in here. So if they open it up and then they kind of find a way to clamp it open, and then they point into this temporal lobe rather than inwards straight, kind of point this way downwards and into it, they're most likely going to be pointing at the Herschel's gyrus, right? And that would be the primary auditory cortex, right? And so that's how you would know the difference between that Herschel's gyrus and then if you were to go straight, it'd be another part instead. So lateral fissure or sylvian fissure is the temporal lobe, and then if you were to peel back and point inwards into that temporal lobe on the inside, there you would see Herschel's gyrus, which is the primary auditory cortex. So here in the temporal lobe, around this section here, this would be Wernicke's area here, right? And so this would be the secondary association cortex, right? So on the inside you would have the Herschel's gyrus, which is the auditory cortex, and on the outside you would have Wernicke's area here. Okay, so again, not to be confused with Broca's area here, right? So 2 finger-like structures away from the central sulcus, and then here's Broca's, and then here's Wernicke's area. So this would be Brauman's area 22. Should be all this section here. I think here you can't really see the parahippocampal gyrus, but essentially it would be kind of here on the temporal lobe. If you were to open it here, you would see it around here. You can't see it here. However, you can see the cingulate gyrus. So it would be this part right here. This gyrus here that's right on top, so superior to the corpus callosum. This is your cingulate gyrus here. And you have here the fornix right here, this area right here, fornix that ties into here. Okay, right here, this fornix, and their hypothalamus, which is right here. So here you would have the infundibulum that connects, right? But we'll get to that part later. But here's the hypothalamus. And the thalamus is this round part, this bulge here. So if you feel it, kind of feel that bulge there. So in the middle of the thalamus here, you have the interthalamic adhesion. And then that's that part that connects both thalamus, right, from the right to the left. And then your amygdala, can't really see it here, neither the uncus. But essentially, if you were to see the hippocampal gyrus around here inside the temporal lobe, right? So here's the temporal lobe. You open it here, you'll see it in behind there. You'll see that the uncus is at the very end, and then you'll see the parahippocampal gyrus just kind of flow out from that one. So if you go to page 42, figure 2.24, the limbic system, you'll see all those that we're talking about. And you'll see the parahippocampal gyrus. Right, so you'll probably see it somewhere on the temporal lobe. You'll see that it's kind of coming out, the parahippocampal gyrus, and then at the end of that would be the uncus. Okay. And then the insular cortex would be, let's say we were opening here, this sylvian fissure, or right, if we're opening it here, if we're to look straight in there and they're to actually put a probe right in the middle, right, just opening it and then pointing inwards, that itself, that would be the insular cortex in there. Okay. So if you look on that same page, right, 42, figure 2.24, but B, you'll see that on B in there, when it opens, it only shows that Herschel's gyrus, but you'll see it here, right? So this part here, right here, that would be the insular cortex here, right? Okay. And here on top of here, you see that right there. You have your parahippocampal gyrus, and then you have the uncus at the end. I'm sorry, the uncus right here at the end, and then the amygdala over here. So anterior to the uncus would be the amygdala. So here now we're going to the ventricles, right? So this pink part here would be the choroid plexus. See, that's all pink. And you can kind of see the choroid plexus here too on the brain if you're looking at it here. Inside that pink part here is the choroid plexus. Okay. So these would be your lateral ventricles, right? So you have these two ventricles, right? And then let's go back here. Right, again, the ventricles are just spaces essentially filled with fluid, the cerebrospinal fluid. Okay. So now you have here the choroid plexus. You have the septa pellucidum, which would be this kind of layer that's covering that part there, and then your fornix here, right? Like we mentioned last time. Okay. So just mentioning fornix twice there. So I would say maybe really know that one. So again, choroid plexus, fornix, and septa pellucidum. So here are the lateral ventricles, right? Lateral ventricles here. And then the interventricular foramen here, that, or foramen of Monroe would be that, right? See this hole here? That's where the interdynamic adhesion goes through. That's why it's got that hole in there. Okay. So here, the interventricular foramen of Monroe. Then the third ventricle here, right? Third ventricle here. So not to get confused, right? Trying to get confused that in between the lateral ventricles and the third ventricle, you're going to have that interventricular foramen here. Okay. See, even this would be an interventricular foramen here. Because it's just the bridging between the lateral ventricles, and the third ventricle. That bridge there, right? See that bridge there, bridge. And then between the third ventricle and the fourth ventricle, you're going to have this, the cerebral aqueduct, or aqueduct of Sylvius, right? So here's the third ventricle, or here's the interventricular foramen that feeds into the third ventricle. Right, all of this part, and then going into the cerebral aqueduct, and then going into the fourth ventricle here. Now in this fourth ventricle here, then this kind of separates, right? So if it goes here in the middle, it will be the foramen of Magendie, and if it goes lateral, it'll be the foramen of Luschka. But I don't think it mentioned the Luschka, so it would just be the foramen of Magendie, and then out here would be all that spinal, the central canal. Okay.